Winter holds the steppe beneath a heavy hand, and the map looks like a lung that has forgotten to breathe. Snow has turned to crust, crust to slush, and slush to a glassy sheen where ruts shine like scars. After Stalingrad, the front does not simply bend, it sags like a tired rope. Kharkov stands in a throat of roads and rails, a stern syllable that refuses to concede its value. Armies move around it with the gait of men who have learned humility and the price of haste. In this pale light, the archetypes step forward as if summoned to a tribunal, the hammer that broke in the frost, the shield that wavered under too many blows, and the fencer who believes timing is stronger than muscle. The word for the last is counterstroke, but on the ground it looks like patience sharpening a blade. The Soviet thrusts of February come on like a thawing river, multiple channels, frothing edges, momentum declaring itself a virtue. Rifle divisions ride the decks of T-34s. Tank brigades push through villages with names swallowed by frost, and the sense of recovery after the Volga becomes its own intoxicant. A doctrine of deep operations wants to write a long sentence across the South, punctuating it with the cities of the Donets. In the imagination of cold, stiffened men, the war will be ended by relentless addition, more tanks, more miles, more bridges flung down like planks of certainty. Yet addition alone has an enemy, and it is the mind that knows subtraction. On the other side of the ledger, a thin mobile reserve spreads itself like a net. The formations are not ghosts. They are bones with sinew still attached 4th Panzer Army with its armored habits. A panzer group gathered like a fist, Grossdeutschland smoothing the map with method, and, in the background of every rumor, tigers that are less cat than doctrine made visible. Names known to the historian carry their weight into the snow Hoth as the vocabulary of maneuver. Manstein as the geometry that disciplines violence. A philosophy comes out of the cold, elastic defense, refusal to trade blood for terrain, the promise that withdrawal is the prelude to angle. You watcher at the edge of the field are tempted to call it cunning. The ground calls it the only arithmetic that still pays. The thaw plays traitor and ally by turns. Tracks snarl in mud like chains swallowed by a bog. Roads collapse into the honesty of clay. But there is a window when the night hardens the ruts and dawn holds its breath. And in that window, steel can run. The counterstroke is not a theatrical flourish. It is a set of verbs placed with economy hold just enough. Refuse what cannot be held. Concentrate where the enemy's appetite has outpaced his digestion. Divisions are pulled along railheads with the resentful efficiency of engines that know they are being asked for miracles. Combat commands reform with the tidiness of a carpenter laying out tools. The map sheds the looseness of panic and tightens into a bowstring. Kharkov's approach roads become mirrors for archetypes. On one lane, the T-34 appears as the mass-made spearhead of a New World sloped armor swallowing distance. Men on its decks smiling with cracked lips because the direction is right. On the facing lane, a Panzer IV with the long 75 looks like an answer composed in a colder grammar, killing at ranges that punish enthusiasm. Between them stands the Tiger, novelty made ritual, a square-jawed paragraph that declares, if you come frontal, you will explain yourself in smoke. Yet the hardware is only the furniture of a deeper play. The counterstroke lives in sequences recon that does not guess, artillery that marks the trees instead of the sky, march tables that wage war against chaos. The essence of the maneuver is psychological, convince the enemy he is still advancing while already beginning to fall. Villages along the Donets learn to be questions. A steeple broken by yesterday's barrage shows a cross-section of rooms where bread once cooled, a school with its blackboard intact hosts, a map drawn in chalk and erased by the tremor of guns. Rifle regiments push through, their breath fuming like promises. Behind them, the workshops of victory kitchens, radio trucks, the odd captured cart draw far out, and the distance between tooth and root becomes dangerous. It is here the counterstroke chooses to stand, not as a wall, but as an absence where an attack expected presence. Panzers slide along the flanks like skaters on a hard pond before noon, cutting in with a coolness that is not a lack of passion, but a suspicion of waste. A battalion commander learns to love curves, a hook instead of a headbutt, a bend where the enemy is straight, a pause where the enemy lurches. The city itself becomes a magnet with changing poles. Streets freeze at night and thaw into betrayal each afternoon. Facades are bandaged with planks. Courtyards hold the burnt hulks of yesterday's certainties. A tank, approaching an intersection, learns the sermon of angles. An infantry platoon, door by door, writes patience as punctuation. Once the doctrine screamed for a storm. Now it whispers for a pull. Draw the attacker into an alley of choice. Make his optimism fit the width of a lane. Then deny him both exit and narrative. In that intimate theater, Panzer grenadiers become arithmetic, a fixed base of fire plus a moving blade, multiplied by a street plan memorized overnight. T-34s that ran like wolves on the open field find themselves hounds with leashes held by walls. The counterstroke is not pure speed, it is tempo. A corps is pulled off a line that no longer requires its presence and flung where presence will be paradox, the thing the enemy assumed absent. At one bend in the river, a bridge is spared because the plan needs it. At another, it is burned because the plan is not a gentleman. Characteristics take on meaning as if model numbers were adjectives. Panzer IVs as civilized killers at medium range. Tigers as cold arguments placed at intersections the map calls decisive. Assault guns as the modest confidants of infantry who know that a single wall is a better ally than a poem. Across the way, the T-34 does not sign out of the story. It fights with a shove that will not be educated. Its crews learning to listen for the sideways voice that says flank or burn. Operational art gathers itself into a face that smiles without warmth. Attacks do not merely hit, they hinge. In the south, a Soviet spear that had written meters of triumph finds its flanks handled like delicate glass. Divisions that were restless move backward in tidy distress. A salient collapses the way ice collapses into water, announcing and finishing at once. The counterstroke shapes an encirclement not out of hunger, but out of punctuation cut. Pause. Cut again. It feels inexorable not because it is brutal, but because it is logical. You feel it in your own chest, the click when the combination aligns. The city shifts color. After days of push and pull, gray winter light is replaced by something metallic, as if victory itself had a tint. Kharkov is not yet claimed, but the debate over its ownership is conducted in the present tense. Smoke lays a hand over the cathedral dome. Tram lines sag like discarded wires. A square receives tanks like a basin receives water with resignation, then with stillness. Street names are mumbled. Barricades gain and lose meanings faster than men can memorize them. Inside the walls, small rooms become arenas for archetypes stripped to skin youth against experience. Optimism against cunning, mass against angle. Outside the walls, the ring tightens with the courtesy of a noose applied by a professional. For the soldiers moving through this ballet of iron, time shrinks to the size of a trigger squeeze. A gunner learns to count the beats between breath and recoil. A driver learns that clutch and conscience share a muscle. A runner measures courage by stairwells. Yet above their heads, the larger argument continues in meters and minutes. The counterstroke insists on never hurrying where haste would spill, on never resting where pause would invite a return of the flood. It is a political theology enacted through marching boots and the creak of leaf springs that a broken army can be taught boundaries again. That space is not a possession, but a negotiation. Snow returns one evening like a curtain drawn across a wound. In its hush, engines sound almost apologetic. Columns slip along the edges of woods where black trunks mark time. A road sign bent. Bullet-pocked points in three directions no one desires. A tiger stands broadside in a street. Not a roar, but a pronouncement. To its left, Panzer IVs incline their turrets with the politeness of craftsmen. To its right, infantry file along a wall and listen for the last dangerous room. Against them, battalions that had marched east-west for days now discover north-south. And in that simple change, the heart learns fatigue. Man's counterstroke, you realize, is not merely a physical event. It is a psychology that convinces the confident they are late. In the morning, the city will be made to speak in a different language. Tonight it mutters. Fires die of exhaustion. Ammunition pouches feel light, then heavy, then light again as men count courage and cartridges as if they were the same. Somewhere a telephone rings in a building no longer connected to any system. Somewhere else a chaplain hums under his breath, and the melody is older than the uniforms in the room. The counterstroke's final notes gather behind the teeth of its musicians. The blade, honed in retreat and tempered in frost, hovers above the map's throat. Morning leans into the city with the weight of intention, and the outer districts begin to trade allegiances like nervous coins. The counterstroke tightens not with fury, but with geometry, one hand on the western arteries, another cupped under the southern suburbs, a third implied more than seen touching the northern exits with the gentleness of a trap. Names gather and edge Krasnograd, Pavlograd, Losovaya, as if the syllables themselves had acquired treads. Corps that were once a rumor resolve into a discipline of banners, Grossdeutschland as the craftsman's pride. 4th Panzer's command settling on crossroads with the assurance of men who recognize leverage, and the armored fist that history will remember for its sharp knuckles, 3 divisions marching under a single cold idea. The tempo becomes a creed. Where the Soviet thrust had stretched like a runner in long strides, now those legs tangle with map pins. Operation Star and Operation Gallop names that promise forward motion find themselves speaking backward, verbs regroup, consolidate, hold. The T-34, still the wolf of open ground, arrives in villages whose streets are too narrow for myth. On the corners of chalked houses, men with Panzerfaust learn proximity as sacrament. Along hedgerows of frozen willow, long 75s claim the ranges where enthusiasm used to be armor. You, who hoped for clarity, are given instead the brutal precision of timing, deflect the blow, refuse the flank, commit the weight at the breath between noon and thaw. Snow thickens, then thins, a metronome for marching. Along rail spurs that still remember the Volga's cargo, regiments shuffle in stiff lines, boots sawing slush into sheets. A tiger rotates its turret in a yard where old freight cars lean like drunks. The square-jawed front is a doctrine, the side armor a cautionary whisper. It speaks rarely, but each word lands with the calm of a judge. Panzer IVs move in pairs like carpenters trading tools without looking. An assault gun tucks in behind a shed, its low roof frosted, its barrel aligned with a lane that will soon be a sentence. The counterstroke favors the artisan, the overextended favor hope. East of the city, the river bends with the implacability of a rule. Bridges, some saved on purpose, some spared by fortune, carry men from one premise to another. In the marshy fields, the night-hard ruts hold just long enough for columns to pass. By afternoon, mud returns with legal rights and seizes wheels for non-payment. So the plan learns to breathe with the day, freeze run, thaw, wait, freeze run. A headquarters marks the cadence on a wall map with colored pins, then erases and repins because war is a draftsman with a nervous hand. The beauty of the maneuver is not its elegance, but its refusal to be hurried by elegance. The blade understands that patience can be an edge. In the suburbs, the street plan argues like a pedant. Squares lead to alleys with no courtesy. Tram lines glitter and betray. Panzer Grenadiers, the novelists of block fighting, split squads into Claus's fixed base, moving phrase, a comma of smoke, the verb of a rush. A T-34 bursts from behind a kiosk, slings a shot that ricochets from a facade as if the city objected to punctuation, then reverses into a yard where a tiger's pronoun becomes a period. The duel is not fair. Battles rarely are by design. Yet fairness has never been warfare's metric. If fit is, the counterstroke fits the city like a key cut from yesterday's map. Rumor travels faster than couriers. The name Hoth walks along corridors of frozen breath. The name Manstein arrives like a theorem admitted even by those it defeats. Draw the enemy forward, make him heavy with success, and then touch him at the joints he forgot were joints. Across the lines, Soviet staff study their own arrows with a chastened eye. Corps that had been confident nouns convert to adjectives: tired, thin, detached. Radios buzz with the optimism of plans drafted 2 days ago being asked to speak for tonight. Officers stand over maps and press palms flat as if to iron the future into cooperation. The counterstroke's genius is that it leaves no time for ironing. Outside Kharkov's southern rim, the fields stage a lesson in negative space. Instead of a frontal chorus, attacks come as praise for absence, a feint that shows just enough helmet to be believed. A motorized hook that branches off in the half-light toward the rear of a regiment busy with its own narrative. A neat parceling of effort that keeps the enemy guessing which noun will become the verb. Not yet is the refrain, and now the surprise. Where the step opens even briefly, the long 75 finds its comfort zone, and crews practice the unromantic virtue of first-round hits. A Soviet column, confident of morning, loses its left margin to a silhouette it misread. The line wavers, then corrugates, then agrees to go backward in tidy anger. Withdrawal, taught on the Volga as a prelude to trap. Here becomes a reaction without sting. Elsewhere, the weather commits a short treason sun, then sleet, the kind of afternoon that ruins optics and morals together. Yet even in that gray, the pattern holds recce running on the nerves of skiers. Artillery disciplined enough to shift by quadrant rather than drama. A logistics tale that looks like a rosary in motion fuel Bowsers, wrecker trucks, the Priestley van of a workshop company that can trade a broken track for an hour of future. Behind them, the field bakery exhales its thin mercy. Behind that, the field graves unit measures grief with tape and kindness. In the machinery of the counterstroke, there is room for sorrow, but not for pause. Kharkov's name changes color as the ring creases outward, then inward. The German thrust from the southwest leans into the city like a shoulder against a stuck door. From the west, another pressure appears as if from a hallway discovered overnight. The Soviet defenders fight as professionals. Brigade flags stiffen the wind of movement. Anti-tank guns emplaced in courtyards where laundry once spoke of peace. Every room contested becomes a stanza. Stairwells claim their dead with indiscriminate appetite. Yet the tempo keeps jumping one beat ahead of comprehension. At an intersection, a Tiger parks nose down into rubble to make a moving barricade. 2 Panzer IVs bracket the street like bookends. Infantry reappear from cellars in a choreography learned since dawn. The alley decides it belongs to the side that decided first. The counterstroke's harshest beauty is its refusal to chase every success. A corps commander reads the temptation to pursue and chooses instead to turn, to cut, to close. Encirclements are sketched not with arrows but with erased options. Units that might have been annihilated are permitted escape along corridors that lead nowhere profitable. Space is granted where time is to be stolen. Time is taken where space cannot be spared. The mind behind the map acknowledges the limit of strength and spends it where the grammar of collapse is already halfway written. By early March, the psychology has turned. Where Soviet reports once offered verbs in the future, they now prefer the conditional and the passive. A brigade was forced, a village could not be held, a bridge was lost to enemy movement. In contrast, the counterstroke uses the present imperative take, hold, pivot, press. Momentum changes the angle of light. Even the snow seems to fall in lines that favor one compass point. A tram, shrapnel-pierced, sits at a stop sign telling a truth as old as siege: nothing moves forever. In that stillness, Panzers glide with the confidence of machines inside a task they were designed for. T-34s fight like magnificent improvisers who have been handed a bad script. The climax arrives with an absence of theater that feels like cruelty. Block by block, the map is inked in. The third day's advance overlaps the second days in neat rectangles. Couriers stop dying in certain streets and resume in others. Battalion diaries begin to use the phrase as planned. An officer scribbles in the margin, "House fighting again," and the banality of that again contains both horror and mastery. When the city's center yields, it does so like a stern man who will not beg quietly, under pressure, with a dignity that belongs more to the people inside the walls than to the flags over them. The counterstroke does not stop with possession. It secures a thesis. North and east of the city, pursuers clip at rears. forcing order on retreat. South of the city, roads are made honest by posts that understand their duty. Behind, supply wagons rediscover the luxury of schedule. Ahead, reconnaissance pays in thin blood for certainty. The weather relaxes by degrees. The ground, bruised, offers its surface without complaint. In the headquarters where the plan's spine was first sketched, coffee cools beside a map revised to match reality rather than aspiration. The blade, honed in retreat, has cut a clean arc. You reader of arrows and owner of sympathies are left with an uneasy understanding. The counterstroke has displayed a species of beauty that is dangerous to admire clarity amid ruin. Economy within killing, timing as the quiet tyrant of outcomes. It has also revealed the clay of victory, finite fuel, finite men, finite days when the ruts freeze before noon. The city lies curiously calm under its new sentences, and the steppe breathes as if relieved to be rid of footprints. For a moment, this reprieve, the plan knows, will evolve into the next necessity. But for a breath long enough to count, the instrument has played the exact note it was built for, and the winter has conceded that angle can prevail where mass has overreached. The capture becomes a hinge rather than a full stop, and the map swivels on it. North of the soot-streaked streets, the land widens into fields that still hold winter under their crust. To the south, the roads zipper into villages whose names are more breath than voice. The counterstroke does not take victory as permission to idle. It treats possession as an angle. Bridges are left intact where they serve the blade. Gone where they would return bite to the hand just struck. Out beyond the city's rim, formations that had overreached tank armies stretch thin by optimism, and miles begin to learn how absence defeats momentum. A mobile defense that only yesterday looked like hesitation now declares itself a stratagem, fulfilled lure, fix, unbalance, and then close. The archetypes persist, but they have changed suits. The tiger remains the street's magistrate, pronouncing at intersections with square-jawed certainty. The Panzer IV remains the civilized killer at the long garden's end, arguing from distance with the crisp syntax of the 75. Assault guns continue as confidants to the infantry, dry-voiced and dependable, speaking truth to walls. Yet now there is a chorus that matters more, the SS Panzer Corps. Not a whisper, but a cough in the cold morning air. Leibstandard, das Reich. Totenkopf names that will dress themselves in myth and disdain, that move with the assurance of units taught to strike briskly and leave adjectives for later. Their doctrine is tempo shaped into knuckles. You, who distrust romance, are asked to see form without flattery skill that is not innocence, clarity that is not kindness. Belgorod flickers on the northern horizon like a metal tooth in a gray mouth. Between here and there, the Donets loops with a mind of its own, and the old Izium Bend holds a memory of disaster cheerful enough to instruct anyone who listens. Soviet spearheads that had once blown past crossroads like riders late to duels now discover the cost of a map drawn with very long lines. Popov's mobile group, a rash of armor thrown forward to complete a legend, finds its fuel measured in hours. 3rd Tank Army and 69th Army learn that the winter window closes at noon, and the afternoon belongs to mud and misgiving. Radios still pronounce verbs in the future tense. Logistics speaks in conditional clauses. The counterstroke uses that grammar as a weapon meet where the pronoun is they, arrive where the verb is must, leave only when can becomes ought. On the approaches, the steppe shakes out a thin thaw and then tightens each night into a brittle permission for movement. Columns time themselves to the hour when ruts harden and verges quiet. Reconnaissance runs like fingers across a blind man's face. Feel the edges, find the hinge, decide the pressure. The decisive tactic is neither charge nor wall. It is the sidestep that turns an enemy's front into a flank. A Soviet brigade wakes at dawn believing itself to be a spear and realizes by afternoon it is a rib. The long 75 writes this discovery into steel. Navelwerfers smear commas of fear across assembly areas that had been comforting squares on yesterday's overlay. Kharkov, meanwhile, must be made to mean something more than a photograph. The city's center is combed for pockets. The outer belt is stiffened into a springboard. In Dzerzhinsky Square, the facades wear a new pallor, and tram tracks scribe the memory of direction under ash. Cleanup is not a euphemism. It is a method roof by roof for snipers whose patience outlived their luck. Cellar by cellar for caches that taste like yesterday. Corner by corner because each corner is an argument. Grossdeutschland sets its machine guns in squares like chessmen and waits for the sentence that requires their punctuation. 4th Panzer's commands feed the road net with companies like sand into a sandglass. Always just enough to measure, never enough to spill. The city ceases to be a target and becomes a tool. Out beyond the tool, the counterstroke extends its hand. The southern sweep works like a scythe. The armored fist arcs around, brushes the Donets with the knuckles of bridgeheads, and then swings north, aiming to close fingers behind the units that had run forward with spirits high. At the hinge, Totenkopf leans into river crossings with engineer blood for mortar. At the blade, Leibstandart flows along lanes where the thaw's gloss turns every turn into a lesson. At the pivot, Das Reich settles with the patience of carpenters, bracing at the right joists before swinging the hammer again. It is not glamour. It is competence lit by winter. You want to know what it feels like to be on the receiving end. It feels like certainty shortening into guesses. A T-34 crew that had slept above the engine for warmth learns that the warmth is now a threat they must move before the sun makes the verges soft, must avoid the cuts where the enemy's eyes live, must trust a brigade commander whose map is 3 hours out of date. It feels like roads that used to accept become choosy, like bridges that once ignored weight now demand confessions. It feels like discovering that the enemy you thought was behind is beside, and the enemy you thought was beside is already ahead. It feels like the second day in a row of moving with half the fuel you intended, and the third day of discovering that someone else's doctrine has memorized your habits. Belgorod is touched and then palmed, the way a coin magician shows and vanishes metal. Its outskirts do not hold. Its inner streets do not become slogans. The counterstroke does not fetishize flags. It wants the crossroads, the sidings, the yards where repair is possible. It wants the view always and only the view, and it takes it by stepping to where the horizon changes meaning. Behind that step, Soviet echelons that would have been reserves become evacuation. And evacuation is not a tactic. It is a vocabulary of loss. Columns shrink to the size of roads. Bridges burn because they must, and must is a worse word than lost. Back at Kharkov, house to house goes from exceptional to ordinary rooms of stove heat and glass dust. Stairwells that reek of cordite and old cabbage. The tractor factory offers itself as a fortress, and men obliged to think in steel for a living learn again the thickness of flesh. Panzer grenadiers move by art piano steps through dark halls, bursts of light that are decisions rather than anger. The cold arithmetic of corners. On the plaza, a tiger lumbers into a position that will make a painter famous and a gunner satisfied. It does not roar. It edits. Across the way, anti-tank rifles crack with the sincerity of obsolete conviction. An anti-tank gun barks with the anger of modernity slightly misapplied. By dusk, the square is decided in favor of boredom and survival, which is to say, held. Operationally, the plan breathes in sequences: pin here, hinge there, pocket if polite, shove if required. The recapture re-educates. The lesson is not simply that a city can be taken back. The lesson is that a coherent idea can reassert itself through exhaustion. Manstein's backhand blow is the phrase historians will use, but the soldiers know the weight in their shoulders and the grit in their teeth. The mind behind the map never loses track of cost. Casualty lists lengthen like shadows. Every clean encirclement has a ragged edge of men who walked out. Yet the sum holds a front that swelled with confidence has been taught humility. A winter that crowned pursuit has been made to kneel to angle. You might ask about justice and be answered by procedure. Justice is not in the caliber or the camouflage. It is in the refusal to make a gesture that cannot be supported next week. You might ask about genius and be answered by timing. Division A arrives the day before mud. Division B leaves the night after ice. You might ask about heroism and be shown a wrecker that pulled a stuck tank from a causeway at Oro 300, a quartermaster who guessed correctly about a sighting, an engineer who lay on a plank over freezing water to tamp a charge under a timber. The counterstroke's poetry is written in those exhausted monosyllables pulled, guessed, tamped. March sharpens the air in the argument. The pocket south of the city contracts in the way a truth contracts wider at first because men misread it, narrower later because they cannot avoid it. Soviet formations that a week ago were promised an after-Stalingrad triumph now promise only to get out. Some do, and the steppe refuses to be sentimental about either success. Others do not, and the steppe refuses to be sentimental about failure. The Sukholier SS Panzer Corps writes its record in kilometers that will trouble consciences in other dimensions. The opposing corps write theirs in casualties reported without adjectives. Over all of it, the doctrine of angle sets its calm palm, measuring, reallocating, moving the hour hand a notch forward. By mid-March, the city stands under a new grammar held organized, oriented. The streets reopen not to commerce but to columns. The squares accept vehicles as facts. A tram, painted in ash, sits at a stop and remembers its purpose. The Donets runs sullen and low as if unsure it wishes to be river and not ditch. Beyond, the line draws itself with a ruler rather than a brush. The counterstroke has carried the narrative from collapse to poise without ever pretending to be mercy. It is a masterpiece of economy welded to ruthlessness. You are allowed to admire the craft and required to remember the cost. Night comes clean and cold. The city sleeps in patches like a quilt with frayed edges. In a headquarters north of the square, a finger traces a new defensive arc on a map, then pauses at a point named more for rail than for soul. Belgorod then returns to Kharkov and underlines it twice. The blade, polished by success, rests in its scabbard. The whetstone of fuel, weather, and flesh sits beside it like a reminder. The men who must carry both to tomorrow pull greatcoats tighter and lean on memory where warmth would have been. The counterstroke has proven what angle and timing can do in winter. Spring will demand a different vocabulary. For this hour, stillness holds. For this breath, the city belongs to a plan that has executed itself cleanly. Spring or something like it begins as a trick of light. Snow thins at the margins of courtyards. Gutters remember water. A thawed track shines like a scar that wants to be a road again. The counterstroke, having driven certainty into Kharkov and pressed its palm against the Donets, now faces a subtler opponent, time itself changing state. Mud is not a tactic, yet it chooses victors for a week at a time. The plan learns new verbs: consolidate, echelon, dig words that look smaller on paper but save larger lives. A line is drawn not in bravado but in spadefuls, and the spade becomes more consequential than any adjective in a communique. The army of angles does not confuse halt with slump. Recovery battalions step forward like quiet surgeons, dragging blackened carcasses of tanks toward workshops that smell of spirit and insistence. Tracks are relayed with the care of men restringing a piano they will play under fire. Gearboxes listen to grease with relief. Barrels get gauged like throats after shouting. The WWII SS Panzer Corps, all muscle yesterday, learns to become ligament-binding sectors, lending stiffness, accepting that the best counterstroke is the one you can reproduce tomorrow. Grossdeutschland takes its rectangles of machine guns and turns them into a lattice that denies avenues rather than inviting melodrama. 4th Panzer studies the road net with the eye of a landlord: which bridge bears, which village loads, which crossroads must become dull for the sake of staying ours. It crossed the river. The adversary reassembles with the stoicism of a blacksmith who knows iron can be reheated. Columns that bled direction now seek the shelter of named rivers and unnamed lines. Corps staff that had written arrows with a generous wrist begin to dot them with pauses and rally points. Rediscovering that depth without supply is only distance masquerading as doctrine. Replacement tanks arrive with crews whose courage is intact and whose craft will take a month to ripen. Rifle regiments absorb drafts of boys who learned winter by window, not by trench. Their resolve does not become less. It becomes heavier, the kind that breathes between the shoulder blades. The city settles into an economy of vigilance. Street corners earn reputations and lose them. Cellars transition from lairs to storerooms. Roofs stop being opinions and resume being shelter. A tram is righted by hands that remember civics class. And for a minute, the square looks like a place where people might argue about prices again. Then a courier motorcycle slices across the cobbles, and the illusion folds without bitterness. The map in the headquarters is repinned for defense, colored threads crossing like veins. A field bakery exhales a tired mercy. A hospital tent hisses at its stoves. A chaplain counts blankets as if numbers could comfort. If you demand triumphalism, you are handed procedure. Procedure, at this hour, is the mercy available. Mud becomes a kind of cross-examination. At noon, a Panzer force sinks a little too frankly into a verge and must be bullied back to honesty by a wrecker whose crew look like men who have slept in their coats for a winter and intend to do so again. Tigers whose square theology dislikes slop are parked where their weight can police lanes without insulting physics. They are magistrates again, but ones who stay behind the bench. Assault guns love this weather. Their low humility makes them practical in curves. The infantry, who suffered the drama of streets, discover that a thawed field with good foxholes is a relief with its own teeth. On the northern shoulder, rumors cling like wet felt. Belgorod flickers once more. Not as a prize, but as a bellwether. Take too much interest and you will sink. Ignore it and you will be flanked. The blade moderates its appetite. Patrols probe as if reading Braille across a long sentence. Artillery answers feelers with corrections that are more lecture than slap. A battalion fields its first batch of freshly repaired tanks and learns the pleasure of vehicles that shift when asked. The crews sit taller, not from pride, but from the balance between machine and man that only comes when both are prepared to the same pitch. You stand at the edge of this orchestra and are tempted to demand crescendo. The plan disagrees. What saves men now is not sound, but silence, the deliberate lack of movement, where the thaw would turn daring into farce. The counterstroke's genius reveals its second face, not only the slash, but the rest. Not only the hinge, but the brace. A division refuses the bait of chase because its commander can read a weather map like a hostile poem. A corps chooses to pivot on villages whose names have never been printed outside of almanacs because their wells and bridges are worth more than theatrics. If you need romance, you must lease it from memory. The ground will not sell any today. South of the city, the river meanders like a stalled thought, and there the pocket that had been pressed and trimmed finally yields its last bulges, not with the operatic surrender of encirclement, but with the tired practicality of withdrawals completed. Prisoners come in with hollow faces that neither hate nor beg. Guards walk them to pens with the same economy they used on streets under fire. An officer writes operations completed as ordered and then sits, pencil idle, for the length of a cigarette he swore not to smoke. The arithmetic of success includes these quiet digits. In the rear echelons, logistics performs its plain miracles. A fuel train arrives without drama and becomes, by the counting of cans, the difference between a poised line and a brittle one. A field post wagon disgorges letters that smell of cabbage and coal and forgiveness. A sergeant reads his twice, folds it along an old crease, and resumes the ancient business of relacing boots while standing. Workshops trade strange marriages, a road wheel from a wrecked cousin bolted to a survivor. A periscope prism scrounged from a depot whose clerk has learned to worship the god of left inventory. These notes do not make it into communiques, and yet they are the counterstroke's aftercare. The reason a hinge does not squeal tomorrow. Across the lines, planners with cold fingers re-ink an idea that never dies, resume. Their north spear waits for the mud's verdict. Their south echelons learn patience that feels like penance. The T-34 remains an animal of hunger, but hunger at a trough looks different than hunger at a run. They practice, in billets and between billets. The old sprints with new caution, commanders reminding crews that streets teach humility and fields teach speed, and each must be used in season. Their artillery, so magnificent at volume, studies economy. Their sappers, so brave at axiom, revise a bridge in their heads before laying a plank in mud. They, too, are learning form without flattery. Kharkov breathes a complicated air. Shopkeepers open shutters that do not yet present goods. Children, invisible for weeks, materialize as corners of curiosity, then vanish when a truck downshifts. Soldiers clean their weapons in doorways and are thanked in the universal language of bread, handed from a paper sack. A woman washes a pane until the light returns and sees beyond the smear. A tiger angled like a verdict. She keeps rubbing as if glass clarity might edit iron. The city has swapped one punctuation for another. Period for semicolon. The sentence continues, but its clause here is finished. Command learns to be a custodian. Manstein's idea is not a standing ovation. It is a ledger reconciled. The line that arcs from Belgorod southward buys depth at the price of frontage. Reserves are stacked like coins rather than scattered like confetti. The best roads get guarded not because they are romantic, but because they are arteries. The WWII SS Panzer Corps, for all its bristling reputation, accepts a farmer's task fence, field, fence. Grossdeutschland, professional to the point of boredom, becomes a hinge others count on. 4th Panzer hums, a machine at idle that can accelerate without shudder. Behind them, rail repair crews straighten what wore crooked, hammering spikes that sound like metronomes for the next movement. And yet the enemy's will does not abate. Over the Donets at dawn, observation balloons bob, and with them the certainty that someone across the water intends to write again with thickness. Reconnaissance returns with the old noun's troop concentrations, bridging material, tank parks that look like black crops under frost. The counterstroke's aftermath is not lullaby. It is the clearing of a throat before the next argument. You sense it in the way men cinch belts and in the way officers stare through maps rather than at them. Even the crows seem to choose higher branches. When the thaw slackens for a day, patrols step out to test the edges. They move like readers of a dangerous text, gloved fingers underlining hedgerows, culverts, track cuts. A skirmish breaks along a copse. The long 75 clears its throat and then confirms a lesson nobody likes to relearn. The first shot counts more than the loudest. A T-34 darts, eager as always, then wheels away because the angle is wrong and haste is currently a sin. Neither side is timid, both are prudent. Prudence keeps men alive for the battles that matter, and both staffs have decided that the next one will matter too much to spend blood on rehearsals. Night returns with less cruelty. Hearth smoke rises in thinner ropes. Stars regain their cold authority. In billets, crews sleep with boots aligned, not because superstition demands it, but because routine is the thread that stitches courage to morning. A quartermaster dozes over columns that finally balance. A clerk drafts casualty letters with the care of a jeweler, setting stones he wishes were glass. Somewhere, a tiger's engine turns over once by habit, then settles, somewhere else. A pair of T-34s are moved up behind a barn by a sergeant who believes in being early. The steppe listens. It has learned the timbre of many languages. Tonight it hears the pause between movements. You expected triumph to taste like sugar. It tastes like solvent and tea, like damp wool and graphite on a map, like the salt left from sweat on a collar that will need to be worn again tomorrow. The counterstroke has rewritten winter's grammar and replaced panic with poise, overreach with angle, myth with method. Its bill is paid in names whispered in rooms without windows and in fields with shallow mounds. If admiration feels dangerous, it is because craft and ruthlessness make handsome companions from a distance. Step closer and you see the stitches. When morning returns with a brittle skin of frost, orders move without flourish. Defensive arcs are adjusted by minutes of march. Artillery schedules sharpen to blades. Reconnaissance routes bend to skirt puddled fields. The hinge remains a hinge, not an open door. Somewhere to the north, a new offensive surname is being rehearsed. Somewhere to the south, a different one. Between them, the city sleeps with one eye open, and the map waits for a hand to press down in a place not yet circled in pencil. Breath clouds from the mouths of men who trust timing more than luck. The blade is clean. The scabbard is near. The winter has been answered. The spring is clearing its throat. The last frost of March draws a thin film over puddled ruts, a skin delicate enough to betray every boot that breaks it. Orders are written in quiet verbs: screen, a line, relieve, and then, underlined in a hand that does not shake. One more imperative take. North along the rail spine, the word Belgorod returns. No longer a rumor or a measuring stick, but a door half ajar. Between Kharkov's soot-streaked facades and that metal-toothed town, the land has been combed by patrols until the hedgerows know their names. The counterstroke, no longer a surprise, shows its second talent. It can conclude. You, who prefer the thunder of beginnings, are reminded that endings have a subtler pitch, the scrape of shovels finishing a parapet, the quick cough of engines coming to temperature, the whisper of grease on a travois bearing a gun to a corner chosen last night. The armored fist that closed on Kharkov now extends 2 fingers and traces a shallow arc, Liebstandart on the left. Totenkopf to the right, Das Reich responsible for the hinge. The choreography has the calm of a craftsman folding a blade after the final tempering heat of bend, a test, a light tap against the thumbnail. Panzer IVs move with the prudence of men who expect the mud to renounce its truce at noon. Assault guns hug folds in the ground that barely exist. The Tigers, square-jawed magistrates, are kept in reserve where their verdicts can be saved for the case that matters. Across the river line, T-34s idle with the impatience of animals who do not believe in delays. Tank brigades lean forward as if posture alone could invent bearing surfaces. The steppe writes the timeless problem: who can make a morning last until evening without becoming a monument to impatience. The Donets hesitates in its bed, cold and sullen, a mirror a shade too dark to trust. Engineers coax pontons into place with curses elevated to prayer. Tamp charges under frost-stiff planks that will be forgiven once and not twice. A bridging lane appears like a sentence drafted in pencil. 2 more are rehearsed and then erased by sleet. The counterstroke's grammar admits no flourish smoke. Lay, secure, pass. A tiger noses onto timbers with the slow dignity of a courthouse clock. Its weight speaks the law of loads. The bridge answers without drama. On the far bank, Panzer grenadiers pull into orchards where branches, leafless and treacherous, resemble hands about to misdirect. Wait, says the tempo. Now, says the same voice 1 minute later, and the orchard becomes a movement. Belgorod is more arrangement than city sidings. Low yards, workshops, the stubs of chimneys, a place built to accept trainloads of intention. Its defenses are not ceremonial. Anti-tank guns are tucked into cuttings. Rifle pits harden where embankments offer geometry. The Soviet formations holding it are not naive. They have buried enough friends to recognize a last ditch when the map forces it on them. T-34s lurk behind sheds and dart into view like ideas that mean to be arguments. Machine guns are cited for flanking sermons. But doctrine has become weathered by miles and weeks. Fuel receipts outvote ambitions. An army enamored of the future has become, for this hour, a steward of the present. The counterstroke recognizes a mirror when it sees one and chooses the old trade fix with courtesy. Strike without haste. There is a trick to daylight in March. It promises more than it can deliver. The first hour grants hard edges to fields. The second invites momentum. The third pulls the mat from under tracks and feet alike. Manstein's geometry accounts for it. Attacks are stacked in shallow echelons. Blows delivered while the ground still pretends to be honest. Recce on skis, those spare wolves slip ahead of tread prints to locate the angles that will still exist after noon. Artillery disdains drama and chooses precision, editing only what the next company will need edited. You can feel the restraint as a taste in your mouth: iron filings and old paper discipline, swallowing appetite and finding that it nourishes. On the left, an ambush goes wrong for the ambitious. A Soviet platoon, tucked behind a freight house, pops a Panzer IV in the exact place a chalk circle on last night's briefing board predicted. The tank smokes gentlemanly, crew stepping off with that offended calm soldiers use when physics has temporarily betrayed them. A tiger that was not invited to this alley slides forward with the disapproval of a senior partner. One shell, then the absence where a position used to be. No roar, Just the long exhale of doctrine reminded. The freight house drops a wall that becomes a barricade for the next hour. The platoon becomes a paragraph in a report that will make the case for better scouts. Every victory inside a counterstroke hides a tuition bill. To the right, a bridge is taken and retaken and finally kept. Not by drama, but by a squad leader who understands the policy of a culvert. 2 MG-34s are moved 8 meters. 2 Panzer books are placed where men have already learned not to look. A mortar, given 3 extra rounds from a muley crate, is told to speak only when the accent matters. The second retort of a long 75 down the road locks the lens in focus. A T-34 arrests mid-dash and surrenders its silhouette to physics. Infantry, those patient phrases, cross one by one and take the ditch with relief that looks like boredom. The battle damages itself into normality. Belgorod begins to be plausible. By early afternoon, the mud betrays its own. Soviet counterattacks launch on schedule and arrive in pieces. Torsos separated from legs by verges that have forgotten fairness. A company that set out with its verbs aligned discovers a stanza of minor keys track jams, clutch sulks, a driver who guessed wrong about depth. In such music, the long 75 is a conductor, the Nebelwerfer, a vulgar brass that nonetheless moves the soul, the assault gun, a viola with a beautiful, blunt voice, Panzer grenadiers, coats open, faces gray with the work of breath, moved by the practiced arithmetic of cover wall, wagon, pile, door. A single house writes a paragraph neither side enjoys and then, exhausted, falls silent. Belgorod yields not to romance, but to rules. In the town's yards and sidings, the last arguments are made. A workshop railhead spits a train of wagons across an intersection to block an obvious rush and is holed by a private who has learned to lead targets not by hope, but by habit. An armored car slides along a platform, shoving crates into cover with its fender, improvising a barricade with the gentleness of a thief. A tiger parks half in a shed, half out, its barrel traversing beneath joists that complain like old men. It becomes a balcony from which outcomes are announced. Across the way, a T-34 breaks from concealment and slings a round that would have been history if it had been a foot lower. It is a foot higher, and history chooses another hour. The crew reverses hard and vanishes with the decency of men who understand the math. The last posts snap. Rails sing under boots. Belgorod is done. The quiet that follows is administrative. Engineers tap timbers with hammers to see if they are still honest. Signalers throw wire like fishermen. A company clerk counts men and is grateful that the number, while wrong, is less wrong than the hour before. Prisoners are tallied without adjectives. A field kitchen arrives late and is forgiven for the smell alone. The blade has cut cleanly enough that the whetstone can be put away for a little while. Maps are revised not with arrows, but with lines that mean no further today. The plan is satisfied to be sufficient. For a breath you might read triumph here. The soldiers do not. They read reprieve and posture. They know a line that runs Belgorod-Kharkov. The bend of the Donets draws a shallow smile across the map that pleases staff artists and buys time for railheads to grow arteries. They sense, too, a heaviness gathering just beyond grammar. South of Orel, west of Kursk, on salients that look like questions, forces congeal under code names that make staff stand straighter. The counterstroke has proved winter can be made to kneel to timing. Summer will intend to inquire whether timing can kneel to mass. You, who have learned to admire angle, are cautioned to keep your admiration on a short leash. Kharkov breathes differently now, less like an animal chased, more like a farmer who has put his tools in order for a day that will not be kind. Children return to corners with their shadow tricks and disappear when a column thumps past. A tram rolls 10 meters and stops again, as if to remind the square of the concept. A woman rinses a rag in a bucket and looks up at a passing column of Panzers with the practiced neutrality that keeps food on tables. A chaplain folds a cloth over a crate and calls it an altar. A mechanic places a bent track pin on a windowsill as if it were a relic. The city learns its role as a hinge. Hinges are not celebrated. They are respected until they creak. In the headquarters where the plan was first drafted on a cold table, men lean over a map that now shows proof. There is less coffee and more pencil dust. Numbers are read without rhetoric. The success is recorded, the costs stapled to it. The WWII Panzer Corps, satisfied and spent, notes the mileage against the machines. Replacements are requested that will never arrive as quickly as requested. The ordnance ledger looks like a field of stubble after harvest. Grossdeutschland is shifted a notch. 4th Panzer pivots an inch. Tigers are counted in single digits and placed with the parsimony of emeralds. The blade is sheathed with care, not triumph. Weather reports are the real scripture. Night takes possession of the yards and rooftops. The air is metallic and thin. Somewhere a harmonica offers a tune that pretends to be gaiety and reveals itself as glue. A sentry stamps and resents his boots. Another sketches a barn in a notebook because hands require occupation. The sky is the color that makes men believe in spring. The ground is the color that contradicts them. On both sides of the front, staff scribble code names that will later become chapters. The counterstroke has ended with a geometry a book can teach. The next lesson will be a shape no classroom forgives. What remains is the archetype made plain. Counterstroke as a philosophy: defend elastic, retreat measured, mass points, strike where appetite has overreached, stop when ground and fuel and weather say stop. It is an art clean enough to admire and cruel enough to fear. It has restored a line not with magic but with craft, not with destiny but with discipline. It has taught the wolf to hesitate and reminded the craftsman that clay is stronger than it looks in winter. It has given the city a season and the army a posture. If you ask for meaning, you receive a list of verbs. If you ask for glory, you receive a ledger of names. The plan closes its notebook. The step waits its hour.